the pendulum problem. Let's take a look. I have no idea what this is going to talk about. Maybe about how pendulum probably ruined Yu-Gi-Oh? That would be interesting if it is talking about how pendulum summoning ruined Yu-Gi-Oh. Because pendulum summoning, you have to understand pendulum summoning ruined Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Because it sped up the game in such a way that it was really, really hard to balance it and control it. It was so hard such that when Link Summoning came around, Master Rule 4 came around, Master Rule 4 and Link Summoning was, in my eyes, it was pretty much designed intentionally with the sole purpose of limiting Pendulum, to nerf Pendulum. Because not only did the Pendulum zones just get axed, they made it so that you could only Pendulum summon monsters from the extra deck to zones that the Link monsters point to, right? So it was just a huge nerf to pendulum summoning, and then after that they had to revert it because obviously making everyone, you know, the thing is they had collateral damage, right? Every other deck got harmed by the stupid rule, so afterwards they pretty much reverted it, right? And had Link monsters kind of coexist with the extra deck monsters. I think pendulum summoning ruined the game. They are the most atrocious looking cards ever. They are the worst designed cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! If you take a look at a typical Pendulum card, here's a perfect one. Pendulum Scout. Classic Pendulum card. This was like the first OP Pendulum archetype was Clifford's, right? You just take a look at it, right? It just breaks everything about Yu-Gi-Oh! And like its visual design. It is two different colors, monster and spell. It has these weird little dumb scales, like what the heck are those, right? It has another text box on top of it. It changed the dimensions of the card art. It's just not good. And what the heck is that? They actually put like the serial number here within the text box. It changed everything, right? So I think pendulums were a mistake. Unfortunately, they can't delete it. They can't go back. But that's why Rush Duel exists, right? I feel like Pendulum's ruined. Not ruined, but just... It was a turning point for Yu-Gi-Oh! That they could not come back from. And we'll see what MBT has to think about that. Or has to say about it.
Pendulum. Pendulums were invented in the year 1 AD, when a man named Fuko famously quipped, "Special summoning is much like a prison." Alright, today we're talking about these cards. I know I'm one of Yu-Gi-Oh's biggest haters, but for some reason I have a soft spot in my heart for pendulums. I've played pretty much every pendulum archetype, and taken a significant amount of them to high-level tournaments. I didn't do so good, though. So why do I want to talk about Pendulum today? Well, as Draco Slayer dribbles into Master Duel, more individuals than ever are experimenting with these weird cards that are sometimes monsters, but sometimes spells. This is happening at the same time a larger discussion is...
Also, not really the Draco Slayers. People aren't playing that. They're playing that stupid cringe Valence OT, the Valence FTK stuff, where they get Secret Village of Spellcasters and end on a board with Fossil Dyna, right? As well as like a Monster Pop or whatever. They're not playing Draco Slayers. They're playing cringe Valence FTK. And not because Valence are cool. They're just playing it because they want to play a cringe first turn kill deck.
Is brewing among potential new players about how complex Yu-Gi-Oh! Is, and for a lot of those players, pendulums are the poster child for that complexity. I'd like to spend today talking about pendulum as a noun, the archetype, what it means for Yu-Gi-Oh!, the specific design issues it presents, and how Konami can circumvent those in the future. And we're gonna do our best not to play the one Triff clip over and over again.
Circumvent them in the future. I feel like, I don't know. I don't see like a future for standard core Yu-Gi-Oh! If I'm being honest. I just don't see how they're going to innovate it. I don't think they're going to add another summoning method because I don't think there's going to be another anime. Illusionist is coming. Illusionist is a new thing. It is coming. But I don't know. It just doesn't... I feel like TCG, OCG, I feel like they're losing... Not losing money, but... less people are buying the product, less stores want to hold the product, right? I feel like paper is going downhill, so I don't know like what the future for standard core Yu-Gi-Oh is, to be fair, personally. But whatever. Game's been alive for 25 years. It'll be alive for 25 more, right?
Anyone with a brain would realize it was a joke.
In short, let's talk about the problem with Pendulum. Breaking this shit into 4 sections. First section is complexity.
Yep.
So discussion of Pendulum has to begin with their genesis in the set that changed everything, Duelist Alliance.
Yeah.
At the time that this released, Yu-Gi-Oh was doing fine. Yu-Gi-Oh's always doing fine. We have a really easy time retaining players, but a really hard time getting new players in. So when
I really like that period of Yu-Gi-Oh. I don't know. Like, there were a pretty good variety of decks. I think maybe at that point in time specifically, though, it might have been just hat format. I think it might have been hat format right before Clifford's. I don't know exactly if that's right. But I don't know, before hat format anyway, right? I thought it was a pretty fun game, right? It was very engaging. There's a pretty good amount of deck variety out there, right? Fusions came back with Shadows, right? So I don't know. I enjoyed that period personally.
a new series starts, that's a unique opportunity to potentially simplify the game to a state at which players now feel that they can get into it. And for what it's worth, Duelist Alliance did a lot right. Sure, the decks that were released were complex in a way that cards had not been in the past, but they were also super fun, played at wall combo speeds, functionally reset the metagame, and introduced the pace of play that we enjoy today with decks like Shaddoll and Burning Abyss, which are
Yeah, dude. Shadolls were really cool. Burning Abyss, I hated playing Burning Abyss, but that's only because it was like the second most played deck, or if not the first. Like, so many people played Burning Abyss. But it was cool. Like, it was a cool, like, Dante was cool, right? The archetype was cool.
still occasionally playable. What, 8 years later? 9 years? Let me just go on Glasgow Yu-Gi-Oh's YouTube. Previously, each new summoning mechanic had of course led to waves of boomers claiming that this was the end for Yu-Gi-Oh! And they were stepping away. Synchros, as there's now this addition in my game? I have to add up numbers? Xyz, where do the materials go? Too difficult to understand. But Pendulum was the first time that there was actually meat to the argument. See, these are really complex to explain to new players. If you're unfamiliar, Pendulum monsters have both a monster effect and a spell effect.
Wow.
These effects can be activated while it's put into one of two pendulum zones, which were added to the board with the release of this set and Master Rule.
They created 2 new zones, and they put it, like, right in between the monster and spell and trap zone. Like, what the f***? Why?
3. Once per turn, you can perform a pendulum summon, during which you can summon any number of monsters from your hand
This is the worst design.
or face-up extra deck with a level between the 2 numbers on your pendulum scales. That's right, the face-up extra deck also...
And it wasn't really OP. Like, it wasn't really super OP at the beginning. It was only really Clifford's that was super broken. At least from my memory. I don't remember any other archetype other than Clifford's being absolutely broken.
also exists now. When a pendulum card is destroyed, it is not sent to the graveyard, but is in fact returned to the top of the extra deck, at which point it can be pendulum summoned on a future turn. That explanation is difficult, but it's the tip of an iceberg of super unintuitive discussions and rulings.
Yep.
Pendulum cards are both monsters and spell traps, depending on what position or location they are in.
Yeah, like, where do they go from Exceed Material Detach, right? I mean, I actually don't even know the answer off the top of my head, but at least back then, like, nobody knew that. Nobody knew that. I mean, like, people knew that, but it was just like, I don't know. It's like there was just so many ruling weird things with pendulum monsters and with, like, sending to graveyard versus sending to the extra deck, right? At least for me it was. It's not destruction, therefore graveyard. Okay, there you go.
That means that cards that interact with spells or monsters will have different applications based on how the pendulum card is being played. Replacement effects for moving location, like those on Dimensional Fissure, do override Pendulum's ability to go to the face-up extra deck because those cards have an innate replacement effect that applies when they would go to the graveyard.
That's silly too. It's like any monster sent to the graveyard, but they're not going to be sent to the graveyard. Well, any monster that we got was going to be sent to the graveyard was actually going to be sent to the extra deck, but it's actually now with the Dimensional Fissure is going to go to the banish zone instead. It's like, why is this card future proof? Why is Dimensional Fissure like magically future proof, but D barrier isn't, right? Why is this one like, I don't know. There's like a lot of weird cards that for whatever reason this one is future proof, but other cards aren't.
though they are not doing so. The numbers are weird.
Not that,
there's two
like, I know Dimensional Barrier literally states each special summoning type. That's a bad example, but there are other cards where it just doesn't seem like there are... It feels like with Dimensional Fissure, it was just like special attention was put into it, or it's an arbitrary ruling, right? It's arbitrarily ruled that the Pendulum monsters will go to the Banish Zone upon destruction, when they were never meant to go to the graveyard anyway, right?
Of them, which implies that at some point there would be one with two different numbers. Otherwise, why would you put two numbers on it? But there never was. It was always just the same number twice. The Pendulum Zones themselves.
The point is, it's the most confusing. It's unintuitive design, and it's like you need to consult. You actually need to consult a rule book when you're playing versus a Pendulum player. At least you had to back in the day, and it's committed to memory. It's the most obtuse designed archetype, or not really archetype, summoning type that this game has ever had.
Elves were really weird. They're not spell and trap.
That's why they never did like another main deck one again.
If your hand
they
is
did
too full.
link summoning.
What's the point? Oh, and if you have a mat that existed before 2014, sorry, it doesn't work anymore. The most frustrating part of all of this is, despite this complexity, there was a ton of design space just sort of left on the cutting room floor. Pendulum decks early did one thing and one thing only: summon a bunch of monsters to perform a big monster combo. The fear among players is that this would eventually result in a deck that was exclusively starters and extenders, all of which had pendulum scales, which leads me to 2. It's a big club and you're not in it. So famously, Konami employee and designer of the best Yu-Gi-Oh product ever conceived, rest in peace Matt Bell, we hardly knew ye, claimed that one of the issues with Pendulum was every new Pendulum design had the potential to be a part of this big Pendulum soup archetype that contained only the good cards from 6 or 7 years of card design. Functionally, Pendulum was one big archetype, and any new Pendulum card could be played within it. That makes designing cards really difficult. When the Pendulum cards first released in Duelist Alliance, Konami...
Because they had to take main deck space, right? So it interfered with, like, design of archetypes, right? Now archetypes had to kind of, like, implement it if they wanted to try out the new thing, and it was never really good in archetypes where, like, they added Pendulum cards to it. Some of them... They were good, right? Some of them they were good. I think Pilica or like the Ritual Beast Tamer, that's like one example, one very fringe example. Some of them were good, but for the most part, like Pendulums kind of existed in their own sort of vacuum, and at least for an extra deck summoning type, or not an extra deck summoning type, but like a new summoning type, I would say it's probably one of the most disappointing, because it doesn't feel like they're supporting other archetypes as much as they're just making a totally new one in and of itself, or new ones, I guess.
Was originally very scared about them. This can be seen with the Cleafort monsters. This first playable series of Pendulum monsters all have text on them that prevents you from special summoning anything but Cleaforts. You're not going to be accessing anything other than the monsters that this archetype contains. This was a type of effect that not only had never been seen before, it had not been designed around in previous sets. Because you could theoretically special summon any monster from your hand, a whole bunch of monsters that were balanced around needing to be tribute summoned suddenly weren't. The player base was scared about this too, and early attempts to break Pendulum mostly revolved around cheating out really powerful 1 or 2 tribute monsters. This fear would eventually be realized with a significant series of ARG format tops in which the Ignite monsters were used to Pendulum summon stuff like Jinzo. In the grand scheme of things, that's not particularly powerful, but you gotta understand this was at a time when Satellar Knight was a top deck. But you can't just print a Xenolock on every new piece of archetypal support forever. So eventually, Konami relented. By the time the first of Pendulum's Tier 0 formats manifested in Performapal Pendulum, there were almost no locks to speak of, and one of the most powerful things you could be doing was Pendulum summoning a bunch of 4-star monsters and overlaying for a Shockmaster. Or in America, Hope Harbinger? We were just made. It was just material. It was just, you could make anything. Eventually, this became the norm for Pendulum monsters. A Pendulum deck was one that set scales, Pendulum summoned out a bunch of monsters, and then made a bunch of powerful extra deck monsters that weren't necessarily intended to be made with the infinite number of material you could get for just performing a combo that put bodies on board. Metal Foes, Pendulum Magician, and Endymion. All of these decks looked pretty similar if you squinted. Nowadays, there's one thing that Pendulum decks do. They perform a big-ass monster combo and then use the nigh infinite material that they've summoned as a result of their setup to make a bunch of generic extra deck monsters.
Dude, you would have to be... I just thought of it. With Endymions especially, playing Endymion IRL, it would look so dumb. It would look so dumb with all the spell counters and like you have your little dice, right? You just put counters on every little thing. Oh my god, that would have been... I would have cringed. I would have cringed. You cannot anymore. You cannot use dices officially. What? You can't use dice for counters? What the do you do? What? Wait, why? I don't understand that. You have to keep track without perturbating the board state. So no tokens, no items / dices on the cards. Wait, but then how the hell do you keep track of it? You don't? What do you mean you don't? Like, how do you keep track of the counters? Sheet, crayon, you note things? Ew. What? That was their way to softban Endymion? Really? Yeah, fuck that deck. Wait, yeah, and like pen and paper was... I'm pretty sure pen and paper was allowed when I played. That's so cringe. Counters are cringe, yeah, Endymion's cringe. And like pendulums were a mistake. Pendulums were a mistake. That's the lesson here.
The fears of Konami and the community have come to pass in the way that modern Pendulum decks operate. Oh, cool, you made Apollosa, Baron. Oh my god, you're setting up a Dagdaline. Oh! Be still my beating heart. After Pepe, there were a couple of historical outliers to this type of Pendulum gameplay, but they were bad for a different reason. Oh, in 2016 NAWCQ format, you could play Cleafort Demise, using the Pendulum scales as holding facilities, so you could card of Demise turn 1 without having to pitch
Ew.
anything. Hooray. Which leads me to gameplay. This is 3, gameplay. Not only is playing against Pendulum an insomnia cure, playing with Pendulum often feels really bad too. Because performing a Pendulum summon requires you to have both a low scale and a high scale, you kind of have to kajigger your deck in such a way that you are almost always going to be drawing one apiece. Sure, some decks are more consistent than others and have the ability to, through one card, set up both ends of a scale with something like a Pendulum Call, but even then it behooves you to have as many monsters in hand as possible to perform your long-ass combo board you saw on a YouTube video. As a result, you often don't have too much space for non-engine cards. Like, you're not going to be able to Pendulum summon out an Abiru or a Droll and Lockbird, and Book of Moon is just a card that could have been a monster for your big, silly combo. So as a result, even if you are piloting Pendulum, frequently, you're just staring at your opponent waiting for them to finish their combo and hoping your hand can include enough gas to beat through it. Post-board, this becomes a huge liability because going first, there's a ton of cards that just read win the game against Pendulums.
Yep.
Anti-Spell.
Yep.
Dimension Barrier.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So somehow we've ended up in a position where both playing Pendulum decks and playing against Pendulum decks can be really, really boring. So, 4, how do we fix it?
Delete them. Delete them from the game. Pendulums were a mistake. Delete them from the game. Yep. That's the solution. Nope, I don't care. I don't care. Delete them from the game. They suck. They suck. Literally everyone would benefit if pendulums just did not exist. Everyone would flourish. They would love life. They would come back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Nobody wants to read a novel on a card. A little novella. Nobody. Nobody wants to do it. Delete them. Konami wanted to. They wanted to. They even like soft ban Endymion with that dumbass rule. Right? They totally regret pendulum summoning. They totally regret it. Just delete them.
Well, here's how we've been trying it so far. We've made them all terrible. These days, newly released Pendulum monsters are either unplayable garbaggio because Konami is sidestepping around the pendulum problem of one individual deck that contains every single playable archetype. Or they're busted-ass novels that have a million words on them, do a million things, and get banned almost immediately. I think this is a great opportunity to think outside the box in terms
They are Konami's most unfavorite child. They are the ugly stepchild of Konami's special summoning systems, right? It's just like he said. They're either broken and then they get banned immediately, or they are made to be unplayable. Just delete them. That's the easier solution. Just get rid of them.
of pendulum design. What can pendulum monsters be? Why do pendulum monsters all have to serve the same purpose monster combo that a bazillion other non-pendulum monster combo decks do? What makes a pendulum deck different than a synchron deck, for instance? And truth be told, I think Konami's not doing a terrible job. The last couple of playable pendulum archetypes have been different. Abyss Actor, for instance, has to play the spells by design, so as a result they've baked in a lot of one-card combos and enabled you to draw as few pendulums as you want, though still execute a combo. Your end board isn't going to have Apollosa Baron on it, but it is going to be able to interact with your opponent in ways that are, at minimum, different than other decks. Memorelia is another interesting concept. What if
That's a cute card.
at minimum, different than other decks? Memorelia's
Yeah, that art's like...
another
It's cute.
interesting concept. What if instead of the pendulum zone just being where you put one monster that conceivably could have been part of a monster combo, it was a place where you put a little girl to sleep. And then she dreams about big-ass guys.
That's so cool. That is so cool. This is really cool. What the f***? That monster design is sick. And it's really cool because it's not a pendulum monster. It's really cool because it's not a pendulum monster. The hell is that? Nemleria Realizer? The Dream Materializer Sleeping Princess? What the fuck? That is sick. That is so sick. Too bad they dropped the ball with this one. They didn't drop the ball. They just make them so weak that they can't be playable. It's not... It's intentional. Absolutely intentional.
Big ass beefy f***ers. They hit hard. I like Nemorelia. It's very funny. The new Valmonica monsters are another incredible reimagining of what a pendulum is allowed to be. What if instead of just spaces in the back row, the pendulums represented the angel and the devil on your shoulder, and then you're in the middle making plays based on which one you listen to? Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game that, for the majority of its lifespan, has been very derivative. It's largely retread a lot of ground that other card games like Magic the Gathering already started, which makes sense. Its genesis is in being a Magic the Gathering ripoff, after all. But to me, pendulums represent one of the first opportunities for Yu-Gi-Oh! To do something uniquely different. It's a type of card that does not exist in any other card game, and almost cannot exist in any other card game. And it's frustrating that historically, it's been used to facilitate...
I mean, it doesn't exist in any other card game, but because it's over-designed bullshit. It doesn't exist because nobody wants it in their game. It's over-designed trash. It's just... It's not... They're not cool. Nobody would be insane enough to think that this was a good idea. Except Konami. And then they regretted it. And now, yeah, they have like this cool design space. I do see that, like Nemorelia and the Angel and Devil. Yeah, I mean that sounds cool. But it's like it took them basically a decade. I don't know when Nemorelia came out, but it basically took them so many years to try and figure out like how do we make this weird ass card type we came up with a decade ago like fun or cool, right? It's just... It's sad. About 9 years? Okay. So, I mean, it's close to a decade. Nemorelia just came out. So, yeah, it's close to a decade since Pendulum Monsters' inception, right? That they come out with these more interesting and cooler, different ways to utilize the pendulum mechanic, right? And I think that's cool, but it's, like, super, like... It took way too long, and it's really, like... For all intents and purposes, it's pretty incidental.
the same type of monster combos as every other deck. I really appreciate Konami's willingness to step outside of the box in terms of pendulum design and give us things that are more interesting and innovative than just setting up a silly Baron line. I enjoy that they're giving cards reasons to be pendulum, not just slapping the super type on a card and being like, ooh, now it works with amazing pendulum. Wow! To close this one out, I also think it would do a lot of good for the identity of Pendulum if a lot of the generic negation tools that lived in the extra deck just went away. Appaloosa isn't a particularly good card right now, but the fact that she exists means that decks like Pendulum that summon a bunch of monsters are always going to be considering her rather than their own in-archetype plays when they're deck building. It'd be nice to ban that shit. It'd also be nice to ban Anti-Spell. Why the f is Anti-Spell legal? There should not be a card that reads you can't play your deck. That's it. That's all I wanted to say about Pendulum. Feels weird to end one of these praising Konami's recent design decisions instead of lambasting them. I'll leave you on a hater note. There should be Pendulums in the new Speed Duel product. There you go. That's that's my opinion.
I kind of want to see the Speed Duel products, but okay. I mean, like, yeah, I guess that is a W for Pendulums, but it took way too long. That was a good video, for sure. That's a dub for Pendulums, for sure, right? Those designs do sound interesting. They do sound cool. I still think they were a mistake. I would rather not have it. I would still rather not have them. Valence too. Yeah, Valence is a pretty, like, I would say Valence are pretty cool. But the thing is, it's like, I feel like Pendulums are just so easily abused. Like, yeah, the deploying of Valence from the back row is a cool idea. It's a good concept. I think so anyway. Prep them in the back row and push them out. You only control a very limited amount of space to do so. I think that is cool. But I also think that it's really uncool that it's basically being used to turbo out Fossil Dyna, Necro Valley, Secret Village of the Spellcasters, right? I think that's really lame. They're just so easily exploitable, and it sucks because Yu-Gi-Oh is supposed to be a very archetypical game. You're supposed to be able to choose your characters, and being able to put degenerate stuff like that. But if you don't have those things, those like archetypes are unplayable. I think that sucks. Floodgate's cringe, non-floodgate equals cool. Yeah, I agree. Or at least it's cooler, right? Non-floodgate just means that there are more negates and choices, which is fine, but I mean, at the end of the day, because Yu-Gi-Oh's bread and butter is floodgates and silences, right? Counterspells, floodgates, and silences. It's just always going to be like, your goal is to stop the opponent from playing. Good stuff. Deck. That's what most pen decks have become. Yeah, but it sucks because of how strong generic extra deck stuff are, not because of the super type design originally. I mean, yeah. Well, no, I do think it has a lot to do with the super type design too. I do think it has a lot to do with Pendulums. It's just because they're so easy to exploit. Why are they easy to exploit? It's because it's something inherent to their design. Yes, generic extra deck monsters are cringe, right? Especially in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh, but the design is why they're easy to exploit. Being able to special summon a bunch of monsters gives you access to extra deck, generic extra deck stuff. Being able to get these additional effects as continuous spells and traps, or not traps, but continuous spells, putting them in the back row just so that they can be summoned again, right? Having that kind of recursion, it is inherently like very exploitable.